Okay, so I've been using this word argument, right? What is an argument, you might ask? It's not obviously two people yelling at each other. Instead, we're going to understand an argument like this. An argument is just a series of statements or declarative sentences that includes a conclusion. So one of the statements in the series is the conclusion. And the conclusion is the statement that is being supported by the other statements. So if there's 5 statements, you're going to have one that is the conclusion that's being supported by the other 4. And the other 4 we'll call the premises, or the reasons being offered in defense of the conclusion. That's all we're going to mean. So you gather together a bunch of statements, and if they're being offered as, some of them are being offered as support for another, then you got an argument on your hands. So for example, sometimes I'll write them up like this. Here's our conclusion. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. That probably is not particularly controversial. That's not to deny that Socrates has an immortal soul or something, but just sort of focus on biological Socrates. But if we wanted to give an argument for it, we could. Here's an argument. Premise 1. All human beings are mortal. Premise 2. Socrates is a human being. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Often, instead of writing out premise 1, premise 2, I'll just write numbers. So I'll write like 1, 2, and then I'll put a line between 1 and 2 and 3 to indicate that what comes below the line is a conclusion. Often explicitly marked with therefore, but I won't always do that, so just sort of keep in mind that that's generally the structure that our arguments are going to have. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about evaluating arguments. Here's an argument, right? This one doesn't have a line in the middle, but it has one premise. Wake Forest University is in Virginia. Here's the conclusion. Therefore, there is no free will. So this is an argument against the existence of free will. Is this argument any good? What do you think? I'll give you just a second to look at it. Yeah, it's a terrible, terrible argument against the existence of free will. Let me ask you though, why is it bad? It's a little more complicated than you might initially think. Or another way to put it is there's actually 2 ways in which this argument is bad. I want to encourage you to just right now sort of pause the video and think about this. What makes it bad? Maybe write down a couple of answers, and then check back in a second. Okay, here are the 2 things that make this argument bad. The first and most obvious is that the premise is false. Wake Forest University is not located in Virginia. In case you didn't know, it's in North Carolina. We can empirically check that one. That's not the only way that it's false, though. And to see what I mean, consider a different argument, also against the existence of free will. I've just swapped out this first premise, the premise that said Wake Forest is in Virginia, for a true premise. Now we have Wake Forest is in North Carolina, therefore there's no free will. Now this is like an improvement, sort of, on the original argument in that now the premise is true at least. But obviously it's still a bad argument. If you were trying to convince someone there's no free will, and you're like, I've got something for you here. You know, they're like, I think I'm free, and you say, I have a surprise actually. I think there's no freedom. Here's my compelling argument for that conclusion. Boom, Wake Forest is in North Carolina. They're going to be confused. And the reason they're going to be confused is that there's no connection between the premise and the conclusion. And that's the other element of an argument, that in order for an argument to be good, it needs to both have true premises and there has to be a sufficiently tight logical connection between the premises and the conclusion. If you just have a true premise and there's no good logical connection, then the argument's still bad. You need both components. So whenever we encounter an argument, we want to evaluate whether it's good, and that just amounts to 2 separable questions. we want yes answers to both of these questions. 1, is there a tight logical connection between the premises and the conclusion? 2, are the premises true? If you have an argument where you think yes to both of those, then that suggests the argument is good. If either of them is a no answer, then the argument in that respect is bad. Let's try to make this a little bit more precise. When I say tight logical connection between premises, what do I mean? The word we're going to be using, the technical term that's used in logic, is valid. We're going to be discussing mostly valid arguments. And logical validity is the notion in logic that's supposed to capture this idea of a tight logical connection. Invalid is the word that we're going to use for arguments such that their premises are not sufficiently connected in a logical way to the conclusion. What is validity? I'm going to give you an official definition, and I do want you to memorize this. I think it's going to be helpful, not just for, sort of trivial bits of knowledge, but also it's going to help you when you're trying to evaluate more complicated arguments to see whether they're valid. So here's the definition of a valid argument. An argument's valid if the argument's premises were true, then the conclusion would also be true. Let me say that again. Necessarily, if the argument's premises were true, then the conclusion would also be true. Here's an equivalent way of saying it. And this just means the same thing. You could memorize either of these or both of them. I recommend both, but some people find this version a little easier. A valid argument is one such that it is impossible for the premises of that argument to be true and for its conclusion to be false. Those are equivalent because the first version just says necessarily, if you've got true premises, then you've also got a true conclusion. That's just another way of saying the following combination is off limits or impossible. True premises but false conclusion. The reason why this is our definition of validity is, and here's how it connects with the idea of a tight logical connection. The notion of a valid argument is the notion of an argument that has premises that lead to, of necessity, the conclusion. Like, if you grant the premises, then you have no choice but to accept the conclusion as well. In that sense, the premises sort of take you. There's a sort of movement from the premises to the conclusion, an inevitable movement from the premises to the conclusion, and that movement is logical entailment. So, one thing that's important that I'm gonna emphasize in a second is that you'll notice that the definition of validity doesn't say whether the argument's premises are actually true. And this is why we separated out the notion of true premises from the notion of validity. An argument could meet one of these conditions but not the other. So to see what I mean, here's a silly argument. Premise 1, anyone who drinks milk is immortal. Premise 2, copper drinks milk. Conclusion, therefore, copper is immortal. No, that's not Copper. It's Ollie. He's coming over to say hi. Hey, bud. Do you want to say hi? Say hi to the video? There he is. This is Ollie. Say hi. He doesn't smell good. Okay. There you go. So, this is our argument. Anyone who drinks milk is immortal. Copper drinks milk, therefore copper is immortal. Copper's my other dog. Is this valid or is it invalid? You might be tempted to say it is invalid because you're like, look, the first premise is false, right? Yes, the first premise is false. It's not true that anyone who drinks milk is immortal. Sadly, copper will one day pass away. Very, very long time from now, hopefully. But notice that that doesn't make the argument invalid. Why not? Because validity is the property an argument has when, if the premises were true, the conclusion would also be true. And that's different from saying that the premises are actually true. It could be that the premises of the argument are all false and ridiculous. It could still be valid, though, if, were you to grant that the premises were true, you would then be forced, as a matter of logic, to grant the conclusion as well. And that's what we have with this argument. We have an actually false conclusion, but if we suppose that the premises, for the sake of hypothesis, for the sake of argument, were true, we would be led to the conclusion inevitably. So one way to think about this, and one sort of helpful little mechanism to keep in your mind at first, is you can use this definition of validity to give you a test for distinguishing valid from invalid arguments. And what you do is you start with the actual world that we actually live in and think about whether the premises and conclusion are true or false. In the actual world, this argument's first premise is false, the second premise is true, and the conclusion is false. But now consider an imaginary world. This can be, as long as you don't contradict yourself, as wacky and weird as you want. Think of it like writing a fictional story. As long as there's no explicit contradiction within the story, there could be flying pigs, sure. There could be immortality granting milk, sure. It's not the actual world, we're just imagining. Now, sort of in your mind's eye, like, imagine this world where both premises are true, and see whether, once you have imagined that both premises are true, are you then forced to also imagine that the conclusion is true? So if you grant that anyone who drinks milk in this world is immortal, so here's a sort of Venn diagram to illustrate this. All of the milk drinkers are in the circle of immortal beings. And then you grant the second premise that copper drinks milk, and to do that, we're just drawing copper here into the small circle of milk drinkers. The only way to grant that second premise is to put copper inside the circle of immortal beings. And so once you've granted both of those premises, you're forced to grant the conclusion. Of course, again, this is an imaginary world, but that's what you need to do to test validity. You can't check the actual truth values of the premise all by itself just to know whether it is valid or invalid, with one exception. If you know for sure that the argument's premises are actually true, and you know for sure that its conclusion is actually false, then you can conclude right away that you've got an invalid argument without having to go to an imaginary world. Here's another example. Every Eminem song is an American pop song. Some American pop songs contain rap. Therefore, some Eminem songs contain rap. So this one, we've got a true first premise, right? So every Eminem song is an American pop song. That's true. We have a true second premise. Some American pop songs contain rap. Also true. And the conclusion's true. Therefore, some Eminem songs contain rap. So you might think, great, valid, right? It's actually not valid. Because again, actual truth and falsity is not what matters. What we need to do is check to see whether necessarily any imaginary world you could construct with true premises would also be a world with a true conclusion. In other words, can we consistently imagine true premises and a false conclusion? and we can. All we have to do is imagine a world in which we have American pop songs as the sort of broader circle or category. All of Eminem songs are American pop songs. That's actually true, so we can keep the world the same as it actually is. But now add the assumption that some American pop songs contain rap. Well, now you can see we have a choice about, in the Venn diagram up here, where are we going to put the American, the songs that contain rap. Are we going to put them inside the Eminem circle, or are we going to put them inside the American pop song circle only? If we do the latter, then what we'll have is songs that contain rap not being inside the circle of Eminem songs. And we can do that consistently and coherently, right? We haven't contradicted ourselves by imagining maybe in this world, for example, Eminem sings country music. That's a conceivable thing, right? That would also be a world in which presumably both of the premises would be true, and yet the conclusion false. So even granting the premises of that argument doesn't force you, as a matter of logic, to accept the conclusion, so the argument's invalid. So here's some more questions to think about. Can an argument with actually false premises be valid? Yes, it can, because again, all we need is, if they were true, would the conclusion follow? If so, then it's valid even if the premises are actually false. Can an argument with actually true premises be invalid? Yeah, we just had an example of that. So you can see how actual truth and falsity, and validity and invalidity here come apart. So validity is about logical form. Now we can go back and revisit those two questions that we want to ask whenever we evaluate an argument. Is there a tight logical connection, and are the premises true? The way we're going to put it from now on is we want to know, is the argument logically valid, and are the premises true? A sound argument, this is one more important technical term, is an argument that's good in both respects. It's an argument that's both valid and has all true premises. When we use the word, instead of saying that's a good argument, from now on we'll say that's a sound argument, if we mean it's both valid and has true premises. But if all you mean is logically it's good and you're not sure whether the premises are true, then just say valid. And then we'll sort out whether the premises are true and whether we can conclude it's also sound. So I would write down this little chart here and memorize it. It's might be a little bit hard to get in your head at first, but once it clicks, it will be important for it to stay with you through the semester. So an argument is unsound under every combination here except true premises and valid. So if an argument is valid but has a false premise, unsound. If an argument's invalid, has a false premise, unsound. If an argument is invalid and has true premises, unsound. The only condition under which it is sound is when it's both valid and has true premises.